He he's indisposed. Every day this week. Well, they don't say anything else, huh? Well, I assume that means he's just dodging the issue and he just doesn't want to say that he's dodging the issue. Huh? Me? Tomorrow evening? I can't. I'm indisposed. Hello? July the 1st, 1951. This week, the Korean War is 1 year old. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week in the field, 10th Corps finished up its advance, so the UN forces are positioned exactly where they want to be right now. And on the UN Weekly Public Affairs radio broadcast, Soviet Ambassador to the US, Jacob Malik, said the Soviets support discussions for a ceasefire in Korea. On the 25th, as this week begins, Peking announces that the Chinese think this is a good idea. That's all good news, right? Soviet and Chinese saying this? Well, I'm not sure. If Americans wanted peace, Peking radio said, they could accept the Chinese terms. Malik's speech was also littered with ambiguities of the sort that enchant diplomats. He talked of belligerence, yet denied any Soviet involvement. And the Chinese insisted on being called volunteers. According to Dean Rusk, the degree of coordination and understanding between the Chinese Communists and the Soviet Union was another and very important unanswered question. It would be great if Malik could clarify this sort of thing, but he is indisposed to the rest of the week, which basically means he's avoiding such talks. Some people at the U.S. State Department are concerned that the whole thing is a big propaganda exercise. U.S. Ambassador in Moscow, Alan Kirk, after a few requests, manages to get time with Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. Gromyko says that he personally doesn't at all know what the Chinese think about ceasefire talks, but that the military representatives of the nations actually fighting in Korea should make a military armistice, right? Just military. They shouldn't have political or territorial discussions at this point. What did the U.S. and the UN think of this? UN legal advisor Abraham Feller says the U.S. could negotiate an armistice or a ceasefire without UN authorization as long as it's limited to just military stuff. And of course, they would report any results to the Security Council. That seems promising. All the other nations with troops in Korea are in favor of negotiations. On the 26th, the Chinese Communists broadcast their approval of ceasefire talks by acknowledging the comments of Jacob Malik. However, the Communists stipulate the U.S. must acquiesce to the often repeated Communist demand that Formosa is to be returned to Communist China and all United Nations forces must be withdrawn from Korea. They also demand a seat at the UN. However, on the 27th, North Korea's Pyongyang radio, which daily talks about the war, is no longer saying, drive the enemy to the sea, but drive the enemy to the 38th parallel. And yes, this is picked up by the Americans. U.S. President Harry Truman thinks maybe UN Forces Commander Matt Ridgway should broadcast an offer to begin negotiations for a ceasefire. But there are concerns at the Pentagon. At a Joint Chiefs of Staff meeting on the 28th, Dean Rusk, currently serving as Second Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, gives them Truman's recommendation that Ridgway broadcast an invitation to enemy commanders to have a conference with him. Air Chief Hoyt Vandenberg thinks this puts the UN in the position of suing for peace, and he's against that. He wonders why stop the fight at all while they're badly hurting the enemy, which they very much have been doing lately. Joint Chiefs Chairman Omar Bradley points out the public is not going to be happy and might no longer even really support the war if they just ignore this opportunity for peace. Vandenberg backs off, and the Joint Chiefs then work with State to write a statement for Ridgway. This is what Ridgway's statement, broadcast 8 a.m. June 30th, Tokyo time, says. As Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command, I've been instructed to communicate to you the following. I am informed that you may wish a meeting to discuss an armistice, providing for the cessation of hostilities and all acts of armed force in Korea, with adequate guarantees for the maintenance of such armistice. Upon the receipt of word from you that such a meeting is desired, I shall be prepared to name my representative. I would also at that time suggest a date at which he could meet with your representative. I propose that such a meeting could take place aboard a Danish hospital ship in Wonsan Harbor. The wording has been really carefully chosen here. Obviously, the main thing is to find out if the communist leaders are actually interested in a meeting in the field. Rusk explains to Allied ambassadors, we felt that it was important to continue with the idea that the other side had taken the initiative in this matter, but not say that they were suing for peace, thereby raising prestige obstacles. But we did desire to put the responsibility on the communists to get the idea across that they had brought the topic up. They do not use the word government and call Ridgway UN commander. And they don't say that any approach has been made to him, but that he has been informed of an approach. They don't suggest a date, but do suggest a place. The Danish are cool with making the ship available under its own flag, should there be talks there. There are questions from the ambassadors, though, like, will the Allies be consulted as talks progress? Rusk is kind of ambiguous about this, saying that they'll discuss things that could reasonably be discussed, but other things will be likely kept quiet. And he does not elaborate on that. He is clear, he does not want hopes for peace to be dashed by premature public debate, which, okay, makes sense. The communist forces' next response I will cover next week. Someone else has responded, though. And here, on June 30th, a certain amount of love between the United States and the Taehan-Minkook ended, for the Republic of Korea saw no honor in the proposed ceasefire, which left its people ravaged and still divided. A settlement along the 38th parallel, for all the American and UN protestations of continuance of the goal of uniting Korea by peaceful means, meant the separation of Korea into two blocks for as long as man could count, possibly for centuries. Enduring everything that they have endured over the past year, and then getting nothing but the status quo to show for it, does not sit well with South Korean President Syngman Rhee. And he issues a statement with his own conditions. These are: the Chinese withdraw north across the Yalu River. The North Korean communists must be disarmed. The Soviets and Chinese must stop all military assistance to the north. The Republic of Korea must participate in any settlement, and there will not be any settlement that messes with the territorial integrity of the Republic of Korea or its sovereignty. That's a pretty big and pretty heavy list, but both Rhee and Korea were largely helpless. Not a UN member, but a ward of that body, completely dependent on American arms, fuel, munitions, and economic aid. The Taehan-Minkook had no chance of materially influencing U.S. policy. Willingly or not, Dr. Rhee had to continue as an American puppet or cease to exist. Of course, the ROK Army, the South Korean Army, fights under U.S. 8th Army Command, as do the rest of the UN forces. I talked last week about the U.S. thoughts about increasing other UN nations' military contributions to the war, and I have more to say about that. Throughout the first year of the war, Washington conducted a tireless diplomatic offensive to broaden to the utmost the participation of foreign contingents in the struggle. If the concept of the war as a United Nations crusade, rather than a narrow pursuit of American national interests, was to remain plausible, the member nations of the UN must be seen to contribute on the battlefield. Well, yeah, that's true, though it might have been easier to sell them the war if it was just a war against little North Korea, and not part of some gigantic struggle against communism directed from Moscow or Peking, and possibly featuring millions of enemy soldiers. There's also this. In the first year, the towering shadow of MacArthur, together with his pronouncements, deterred some governments. It was embarrassing enough to be invited to send troops to fight as subordinate partners of the American army. But when there was also serious doubt whether the Washington administrations could control its own theater commander, when the specter of a Third World War hung heavy over the battlefield, even greater fears came into play. An awful lot of countries on this globe still have serious financial issues because of World War II, and the men they send to Korea have to be fed, clothed, armed, and equipped by the United States. Each country is supposed to pay the U.S. $14.70 per man per day. The settlement is deferred until after an armistice. But a battalion and support of, say, 1,000 plus men is close to $15,000 a day, which is $5.5 million or so dollars a year. And while that might not sound so much on a national scale, the French, the Dutch, the Philippines, they're rebuilding their own countries. And the first two have big international commitments beyond Korea as well. So it's not easy. The Turks have sent a whole brigade, so they've got over 5,000 men here, and that is not cheap. I haven't really mentioned them that much except for during combat, so I'll say a few words about the Turkish brigade now. They are very well respected, though they've never before Korea engaged in combat on foreign soil. They answered the UN call for troops last summer, already June 29th, that they would meet their responsibilities. They were actually the second country, after the US, to respond to the call, and then decided to send the brigade July 25th. This is an artillery battalion, 3 infantry battalions, and support and auxiliary units. They began arriving in Pusan October 12th, and the main group came the 17th. You may remember the fight around Rhee at the end of last November. There, the Turks managed to delay the enemy for 2 solid days, helping many thousands of troops withdraw who quite likely otherwise would have been captured or killed. The Turkish brigade was even surrounded, but managed to break free and join U.S. 2nd Division. Turkish General Taşin Yazıcı and 15 men under him received silver or bronze stars for bravery during all this. Then UN Commander Douglas MacArthur had this to say about them. The heroism shown by the Turks has given hope to the American nation. It has inculcated them with courage. The American public fully appreciates the value of the services rendered by the Turkish brigade and knows that because of them, the 8th American Army could withdraw without disarray. The American public understands that the United Nations forces in Korea were saved from encirclement and from falling into the hands of the communists by the heroism shown by the Turks. They lost like 15% of their men that week. I do have to add, though, that for all the praise they received from both Western and Chinese sources, historian Clay Blair disagrees and calls them overrated and poorly led, and says their withdrawal left open the flank of 8th Army. Having said that, they were the only UN force between Wawan and Rhee, and the fact that 2nd Division could withdraw at all means whatever anybody else says about anything, they accomplished their mission of covering 9th Corps' withdrawal. They are but one of the many national forces fighting under the UN banner, although a very large one compared to those other than the US, Britain, and the Commonwealth, and the South Koreans. And this week of the war ends without much going on at all in the field, but hope, apprehension, and controversy in diplomacy as Chinese, American, and South Korean voices are heard speaking about if they want an armistice or a ceasefire, where they want it, how they want it, and any other questions you'd care to throw in about the subject. And the Korean War is 1 year old this week, or as this week starts. You know, just because perhaps there at least might be some armistice talks in the near future does not mean the two sides are not still working furiously on the war in Korea. The UN forces are making new battle plans. And the communist forces? What are they doing? What have they been doing? Well, here is a quote from T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War. On the 1st of July, approximately 750,000 Chinese and North Koreans held the communist battle lines against 500,000 UN troops. The CCF and the Inmingun, the North Koreans, had changed too. The cream of the communist armies had been destroyed, from the Naktong to the Imjin, and from the Imjin to the Soyang. Replacements coming down from the mountains were recent inductees, impressed from rice field and village, untrained, in some cases unarmed and badly clothed, but though they might not be expert at war, these men were used to hard work and hardship all their young lives. Their leaders set them to work, digging. From the Sea of Japan on the east to the Yellow Sea on the west, they burrowed into the earth. They entered mountains from the rear slope, tunneling through to make gun positions opening on the front. They dug bunkers in which a company could safely and warmly bivouac. They dug so deeply into the earth that no conventional gun or cannon could reach them. Well, they've only recently begun this program, so it's not that far advanced. But I'll just say that it does not bode well for a rapid end to the war in the field should negotiations break down. Not at all. But I will be here to cover whatever does happen. And that is thanks to the Time Ghost Army. That is what keeps the lights on here. You too can be part of this. You too can be part of this by joining the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Eric Johnson is the Army Member of the Week, and these are the newest commissioned officers. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.